السر منا لا تهتك الستر عنا وعافنا واعف عنا وكلنا حيث كنا.
Let us begin insyaAllah with Kitab Al-Fatiha. A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Arrahmanirrahim. Maliki yaumiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Amin. Alhamdulillah, we praise Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala for having gathered us tonight here. Philosophy. Inshallah, this session we will begin from where we left off on Imam Al-Ghazali. But before getting to the discussion, there was several questions that I asked to be put to the next time, which is our meeting today, because of the limitations of time. Some of the questions that I remember I did not get to answer was first on atomism and the concept of occasionalism. And then the other question that I haven't answered was from Brother Imran, who asked about the active intelligence and its association with the Archangel Jibril. Yes. And then thirdly, about skepticism in Imam Al-Ghazali. So these are, I believe, I have not addressed from our last discussion. First, as for the active intelligence, the association was done, I think, was already recognized in Farabi, because he introduced the notion of the Aqlul, so to speak, both cosmological as well as epistemological role. The cosmological, so as to provide the forms of things in the material substance for hylomorphism, but the role of the active intelligence in its identification with the Archangel Jibril is the epistemic, meaning to say the role in actualizing intellects, bringing them from a state of pure actuality to the state of the Aqlul Mustafat. Yes, the shall we the active, or rather the intellect, the active intelligence. Yes, not the agent intellect, shall we say. So now the agent, or the Aqlul Fa'al, the agent intellect, its function is to bring out that. And so the scholars gradually, from Ibn Sina and even Imam Al-Ghazali in his discussion on psychology, discuss this identification with, of course, read this Nature of Man and the Psychology of the Human Soul, where Prof. Alatas made the connection that gradually the scholars amongst the Sufis first identified the active intelligence with alayhi salam, but gradually, ultimately, they identified it with God. It is Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala ultimately is the inspired man. They knew not. The following question is about atomism and the concept of occasionalism. Again, since this history of philosophy, its major aims is to trace the development of thought with regards to, I mean, where even when we stop study Islamic philosophy, it is with regards to identifying the movements that contributed to Western thought. So, with regards to atomism, which is ascribed to the school of the which is ascribed to the school of the Ash'aris, and later developed by the Mutakallimun at length. Some scholars, including Prof. Alatas, identified the origins of this idea or this conception, this theory, with Al-Baqillani. But according to Majid Fakhri, in his History of Islamic Philosophy, atomism at least predates Al-Baqillani as developed by the Muslims, except that perhaps he has formalized it, and gradually it became further developed in the writings of the later Ash'aris, including, of course, the late Mutakallimun. Of course, the for the summary of the idea of the mutakallimun, I think to look for is Professor Alatas's Hujjatus Siddiq, Lidaf Zindiq. Yes, in which Prof. Alatas summarizes an abstract of 12 propositions, summarizing the atomistic metaphysics. Yes. So I will just read it because it is a very powerful summary. First, the universe is composed of indivisible atoms which are similar to one another. These atoms are devoid of magnitude, but when combined, the giving rise to bodies is called generation, while the separation of the atoms causing the dissolution of bodies is called corruption. A void exists in which the combination, separation, and movement of the atoms can take place. Corresponding to the substantial atoms, there exist time atoms. Inherent in the substantial atoms are accidents, which don't endure to atoms of time. The substantial atoms themselves would not in their real nature endure two atoms of time, just like the accident in them. But God makes the atom endure for a given time by creating in them the accident of duration. God creates a substance, that is, atoms combined as a body, and simultaneously its accidents. Immediately after its creation, it is annihilated, and another takes its place, and so on for as long as God wills. Thus, the nature of being, i.e., of existence that constitute the world, is discontinuous. And what is called natural law is, in fact, God's customary way of acting. All bodies are composed of similar atoms. The differences in bodies is caused by the difference in their accidents. The accidents which are of a positive and negative kind, such as life or death, motion or rest, composition or its opposite, and other such accidents that logically follow from them are superadded to substance and accompany the body of necessity. One accident cannot exist in another. Every accident inheres in the substance, which is its substratum. Since God's customary way of acting constitutes what we call natural law, and the divine will is not limited by such, that is, with the logical contradictions, unlimited possibility in the world. So the notion of the infinite with respect to bodies and causes are all impossible. Since the 11 propositions summarized above in abstract are not susceptible of proof by sense perception, and since the testimony of the senses is not always valid, the 12th proposition states that the evidence of the senses cannot be accepted in the face of rational proof. Of course, I don't know. I think even for myself, the first time, or I read it the first time, I don't understand most of it. But after, say, gradual reflection of what it contains, so basically the metaphysics of atoms and substance, yes, the Jawhar wal A'rad, is proposed by the mutakallimun to replace the elemental metaphysics or hylomorphism, because hylomorphism assumes eternity in the world for the world, or predicates eternity for the world, because the world is composed of or the being of the world is composed of matter. And so since matter is not created nor destroyed, but it takes on different forms through generation and corruption, so therefore the world has always been and the world will continue to be. But in contrast, the mutakallimun, deriving from the Quran, the world's creation in time, the creatio ex nihilo, so to speak. They affirm the theory of creation. So therefore, since they affirm the theory of creation, envisage a condition in which the world is nothing and then it was. So in the sense that it became, or when it was, so it's composed of these, as we said, atoms, composed together, created nations. Now they exist as bodies. But of course, as bodies, they must also be given duration, because without duration, then their being, their existence would have been a spatial reality only, but not enduring in time. So therefore, God creates in them the atom of time, or in other words, they are being given the accident of duration to last while Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala creates. But since the gradually expanded this thesis as to include the theory continuation and corruption. So therefore, in reality, the atoms, the substantial atoms, do not last and do not endure two atoms of time, except that they are recreated anew. They are being given their being, they are being given attribute of existence at every instance. So this then is the theory of the mutakallimun. Was also influenced by the atomists, and it would be different of the Hellenistic period, the Hellenic period, because as proposed by Democritus, later developed into a system by Lucretius, as in his Natura on the nature of things. This Epicurean notion of atoms or atomism an eternal world composed of this composition of atoms. It is materialistic atoms, although they are indivisible substance, but they are uh, they are not. Uh, the theory of atomism is not uh, coupled together with the notion of continuous creation. In fact, in Lucretius, the notion of atomism, as propounded, tries to derive the notion of liberty, in that the atoms can go in any direction, but it just so happens that it appears meaningful to the human mind. So then it is therefore different. It is only similar in that they consider that the world is composed of indivisible substances, meaning the juz'ul ladhi la yatajazza, but they differ in point of creation and annihilation. They differ in the substantiality of the atoms. They don't consider the atoms do not endure to durations of time and so on. So that's a bit about atomism. As for occasionalism, I think this would make a good end to the discussion on Imam Al-Ghazali's critique in the Tahafatul Falah. We know that the Tahafatul Falasifah is not a work in which Imam Al-Ghazali intends to defend a positive theory of metaphysics. Imam Al-Ghazali had written the Tahafatul Falah properly as a critique of Avicenna, rather Avicenna with examples also from Al-Farabi. And if we were to read the various introductions given, Imam Al-Ghazali gives 4 introductions to that. In one of the introductions, he was saying that he selected Ibn Sina because that is the most elaborate system of philosophy that exists. And he, as in writing that, did not intend for a critique of the entire system of Ibn Sina, except for the aspects of his metaphysics, as the metaphysics in which what the philosophers claim as demonstrative proof fall short of that standard. Imam Al-Ghazali's positive claim is that the philosophers, and this answers the question about mathematics, I think. Imam Al-Ghazali, one of Brother Imran's reflections, warned about a lure of mathematics for its apparent infallibility as a method of proof. Yes. So Imam Al-Ghazali is saying that the apparent confidence of the philosophers, or the apparent confidence accorded to the philosophers, due to their exact demonstration in logic and their demonstration in mathematics, especially arithmetic, made their admirers of the philosophers think that even in the realm of metaphysics, the philosophers possess demonstrative proof. So the purpose of the Tahafatul Falasifah is to prove that in fact the philosophers do not have the standard proof with regards to their metaphysical thesis, 20 of which is highlighted by Imam Ali. Of course, as Imam Al-Ghazali is also a theologian and an alim, he said that 17 of these theses merely amounts to heresy, bid'ah, but 3 of them, if understood in the way that it is presented, now that amounts to kufur. What are the 3 theses which has been which I suppose by now we would have already heard of them frequently, even if we read some history of Islamic philosophy. One is their claim that the world is eternal, both without beginning and everlastingly, co-eternal in fact. The second is the thesis of the philosophers that God knows only universe, Yes, God knows only the universals, but He has no knowledge of the particulars. Then thirdly, the philosophers deny uh, bodily resurrection and affirm only the possibility of a spiritual sort of resurrection. Charge the eternity of the world. Remember the philosophers has combined in their theory the Aristotelian conception of prism uh, and an immanent conception of the world, together with the emanationist scheme of Plotinus, the idea that God created necessarily, and God creating the world necessarily meant that they introduce a further complication. So according to Ibn Sina, yes, and then some other philosophers, the eternity of the world is due to the fact that since God in His being is eternal, introducing the creation of the world in time would take away from His perfection, because it would introduce arbitrariness in God's act. Because there would be a moment in which God creates, in which before that moment He has not created. But assuming that this moment before God created the world was an eternity, how is it it can be distinguished one point and the to the other? So therefore, since all time before the creation of the world was equal, meaning to say T1, T2, I mean T minus 1, T minus 2 at infinitum would have been the same. So therefore, between T1 and the nth number, there is no superiority between one and the other, rendering therefore the you know, like the creation in time, or the introduction of creation in time, rendering it to be arbitrary. So therefore, in order to preserve this, the philosopher therefore said that the world has existed together with God, except that while not being temporally prior to the world, God is logically prior to the world, as if the hand and the shadow. Yes, we know that perhaps supposing for the longest time, our hand has shown shadows underneath. Although we know that they coexist, the being of the hand has priority of the being of the shadow. So therefore, and of course, this the discussion of the world as shadow is then later taken on by the metaphysicians, as Rawardi, and later on even the Sufis. But the notion of um, a logic or metaphysical ontological priority not negate the notion of temporal priority. How does Imam Al-Ghazali solve this problem of arbitrariness? According to Imam Al-Ghazali, in reality, the notion of choosing one against the one good thing over another good thing is not arbitrary. That's the meaning of choice. So Imam Al-Ghazali said, imagine you are presented with a choice of, say, two succulent dates, both equally succulent. Chances are you will not go on the night, stuck in between, isn't it? And not having either one, because either one is good. So therefore, there's no such thing as would eat the dates. Later on, I believe one of the philosophers of the Latin medieval West, perhaps it was Don Scotus, yes, he gives another example. It is said that, as a donkey, he said, being given choice between two hay, he wouldn't be stuck and not eating either one, being stuck in between two good choices, because both are equally opportune. So therefore, it does not introduce arbitrariness on the part of one and the other. So that's how Imam Al-Ghazali proposes. I mean, he's not saying that this is definitely the reason, but he's saying that if he had chosen a particular time over another, it would have not been arbitrary. That's the reality. As for this notion of occasionalism, now this is, I think, one of the most interesting arguments in the Tahafut. Yes, of course, his argument about eternity and his argument against it is interesting. I mean, if you want to revisit the notion of tasalsul, how he denies infinite regret and so on is good. But particularly for the sake of discussing the notion of occasionalism, Imam Al-Ghazali denies um, that cause necessitates effect. According to the philosophers. Remember when Ibn Sina talked about ontology the last time when he spoke about contingent truths. One of the things, one of the relevant distinctions of order for a contingent being to come into existence, aside from preponderance on the side of God, there has to be a chain of necessity, meaning to say one leading to another thing, leading to another thing before it comes into existence. As if to say that the world can run on its own course without the participation of God. So as if to say that God, and this the introduction of neo, the notion of necessity in the emanationist scheme, because God does not, is not agent, he is not the fa'il mukhtar, he is the fa'il mujib. The world flows necessarily from him. So therefore there is no interjection. So therefore there is no choice on his part. Everything flows necessarily from him. Everything could not have happened otherwise. So Imam Al-Ghazali introduced in his critique, he's saying that in truth, when our one in conjunction with an effect, our mind has not really seen one thing leading to the other. What our mind has made the conclusion in this case is merely conjunction, meaning to say everything is so. But it is not in say that necessarily burns, or that necessarily burns, as Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, when he should choose, he can interrupt that regularity in nature. Of course, the philosophers will criticize that, saying that, well, if this is true, then you will not have science. Yes, meaning to say that science is impossible, because if God is arbitrary, meaning to say he can do whatever he wants, then how can you study anything? Meaning to say, how is it that at some point objects left to fall will fall, and at other time it will fall faster than that rate. At another point it doesn't fall at all. Or perhaps you may come home and you realize your friend may have turned into a donkey, and your cup of water may have turned into a snake, and so on. Now all these things makes science impossible. So Imam Al-Ghazali therefore introduced the notion of sunnah, the sunnatullah. Although it is not inherent in those things, it does. Allah Subhanahu wa Taala acts out of acts independent of His mercy. It is due to His mercy that therefore He introduces this notion of customary way of acting. Now this custom Subhanahu wa Taala would usually, yes, allow for the course of time, meaning to say He would create everything in its independent aspects in that thing. And I believe Professor which you can find in Encyclopedia of Islam in the 3rd edition, the entry is on Al-Ghazali, and I believe he wrote a long occasional, in which he said that the occasionalism of contrary to the ideas of many of the ideas of the Orientalists, does not negate the possibility of science. In fact, it transforms science, because possible. Now you have to transpose it in the language of Islamic metaphysics. And insofar as the pursuit of normal science was concerned, Dimitri Gutas, yes, the Hellenist and the Arabist, I think he used to be in Yale, has demonstrated in various writings that in fact the activity of normal science continued well after the time of Imam Al-Ghazali, suggesting to us that it is not true that this occasionalism negated the development of science. Dimitri Gutas puts the date as well into 1350, and after 1350, what had happened was that there is the collapse of the Abbasids, the collapse of several of the Seljuks and several other sultanates, only to be replaced by the three major powers in the Muslim world. And philosophy will continue to develop in these three different strands. One was Ottoman Turkey, the other was Safavid, and the third was Mughal India, or the subcontinent. Yes, but greater and more detailed reveal. In fact, there was another contender, and that is in this period, 1950, the Malay world can also be with sufficient limitations. It has to produce original thought and thinking of its own, particularly in the 17th century. Uh, that inspired Ibn Sina supporting him about emanation from the audience. What you mentioned about the distinction of the conjunction cause and effect. Yes, Whitehead, I think, is a very important philosopher of science to read, um, uh, particularly in his usage of this phenomenology of causation. Remember when Whitehead wrote in the first half of the 20th century, phenomenology was being developed also by Edmund Husserl. But the strand that was being developed by Edmund Husserl focused on focusing on subjective experience. He tried to capture, say, fantasia, imagination, and several experiences that he wanted to scientifically describe the experience from the subjective point of view. And he continued, and when this was continued by say a student of his, Martin Heidegger, the direction was towards being an existence. It wasn't to develop, say, philosophy of science per se, but the notion of this phenomenology of causation is very important. But phenomenology of causation alone will not be sufficient to defend the theory of causality unless it is joined with a metaphysical scheme that can explain the veracity of the data of this phenomenology, meaning to say experienced by the soul. So that the phenomenology of causation needs to be, and this is the direction taken by the Sufi metaphysicians. They develop the direction towards the metaphysics of the names of God and the activities of God and the transcendental use, and they develop the notion of the madhar, the notion of the theater of his manifestation. Out of this, science and its activities can still well be preserved. Yes, but knowing the limitations at the empiriological front, meaning to say at the front of empiricism of our human experience, and higher than that is empiriology, meaning to say a combination of what is empirically observed and logically mitigated, shall we say. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Inshallah, we devote more discussions in this when we arrive at the philosophy. Anyways, so based on this critique of Imam Al-Ghazali and the occasionalism, I think that there leaves one more question, and that is the question of Imam Al-Ghazali's epistemology. And this to answer the other question on skepticism. Yes, is it similar to the Cartesian skepticism? First, we must understand that with regards to Descartes, the skepticism that Descartes suffered was due to a methodical doubt that he purposely applied uh, in order to ground present day science during his time on a sound and a new foundation of metaphysics. And that was because previous to the time of Descartes, there was already the challenge of skepticism propounded by Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne had revived the arguments of Sextus Empiricus and Pyrrhonic skepticism, which was so overwhelming that Descartes thought in order to put these doubts to rest, he had to begin his meditations on this methodical doubt in order to save man But Descartes' way of escaping this devil's trap, so to speak, yes, the trap of skepticism, overwhelming skepticism, was to base his foundation on mathematical intuition. Uh, but as for Imam Al-Ghazali, it wasn't mathematical intuition that he used as the foundation to secure his certainty. He was a man who, of course, was brought up by the Salihin. He went through the madrasah system. And even though he has this, based on his own, shall we say, admission, he has this desire to know the truth. And he wanted to escape the situation of taqlid, because he believed that with his the intellectual precociousness, he can study the truth value of the statements based on his own efforts. He has no requirement to base his conclusions on an external authority, so to speak. But having doubted his senses and the other epistemic sources, reason and so on, he was led to skepticism. His rescue, yes, the najat, yes, his rescue from that skepticism was ultimately a light of God which is cast into his heart. So it is a sense already, meaning to say, Imam Al-Ghazali mentioned that there were these at least two important episodes in which he was saved from skepticism. And one was through this light of God that is cast into his heart, and the other was when he surrendered himself under the tutelage of Mashaikh, and this is the period of suluk in which he affirmed the method of the Sufis. So in Imam Al-Ghazali, the savior, yes, munkid, shall we say, the deliverance from error came and came from knowledge of the prerequisites of mu'amala, and that all grounded his major work, Ulumuddin, to focus on the science of mu'amala, meaning to say, to focus on the science of ethics, of the self towards others, of the self towards itself, and of the self towards God, so that perchance Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of his grace, may grant illumination, the mukashafa. Again, I will not belabor too much on this point. This will take us into a separate discussion. I will just merely indicate the trajectory of Islam after Imam Al-Ghazali. As for those who followed his path in Tasawwuf, its culmination would probably be in Ibn Arabi and the later commentators of Ibn Arabi. These are the later metaphysicians. As for those who developed the kalam of Imam Al-Ghazali, yes, the kalam deriving from his mustasfa min ilm al-usul and his iqtisad fil i'tiqad and his various writings of theology, rational theology, its culmination will be found in Fakhruddin Ar-Razi and the school of the later mutakallimin. And as for the philosophers, yes, amongst those who persisted in the path of the Baghdad Masha'iyun, you will find Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi, yes, post-Ghazali. And then, of course, we have in Spain, Ibn Rushd, where we will go temporarily before we go on to discuss the beginnings of the messages. We know that not long after the death of Imam Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, who initially came from a family of scholars, rose to prominence and became the chief qadi. He wrote treatises in al-fiqh, Maliki fiqh, that is well recognized. But he would also use his talent, yes, to write commentaries on Ibn Rushd, on Aristotle. And we know that of his commentaries on Aristotle, Ibn Rushd had written, say, 3 separate levels. Level would have been, say, It's called the short treatises. These short treatises would have been something like a paraphrase. And then you have the middle level commentaries, um, and then you have the by line commentary. The what is the characteristic of the writings of Ibn Rushd with Aristotle? And first, we know that he wrote the Tahafatut Tahafut, his attack on Imam Al-Ghazali's Tahafatul Falasifa. But we should not think that his attack on Imam Al-Ghazali meant that he therefore wanted to return philosophy to the foundations set by Ibn Sina. According to him, departed. What he wants is the character of of philosophy. What he wants, therefore, is to return, at the very least, to the tradition initiated by Al-Farabi and Kindi, not the departure that he has taken with Ibn Sina. Of the writings of Ibn, which is more, it is the decisive treatise, which is also known as the Faslul Maqal. It's more of a fatwa. Yes, interesting. It is a fatwa that is, philosophically, because in this Ibn Rushd identifies falsafa or philosophy with hikmah, and he, after having identified philosophy with hikmah, with wisdom, which is a positive word in the Quran, he therefore tries to determine the status of doing philosophy. And accordingly, he cites certain verses in the Quran, such as in yes, that use our intellect in order to arrive at truth. He arrives at the conclusion that the usage of the intellect is therefore wajib. Yes, it is wajib, but it is certainly not wajib upon all. It is only wajib to those who meet the criteria and the prerequisite of becoming a philosopher. He's saying that there's distinctions of addressing addressing an audience. The general public is influenced by, meaning to say, through rhetoric, through persuasion, and this, he said, religious symbolic language is better. For the theologian, those who are more distinguished than the generality of people, you appeal to them through dialectics. Yes, kalam, meaning this is a discursive theology. When a person says, you say B, you say as a better explanation, founded on certain foundational basics. The higher level, according to him, which is the one that is that is pursued by the philosophers, is the level of burhan, or demonstrative proof. Therein, within this it to show that therefore the philosophers are of the highest ranking of the human intellect. There is an anecdote, however, that to one of his life, Ibn Rushd came across the young Ibn, in which he wanted to know whether the demonstrative proofs, or so he thought, of what the intellect, the rational aspect of the intellect can achieve, is it similar? Is it the same as what is as what is experienced by the Sufis in their visions? Yes, in their periods of kashf, in their periods of dhawq. Yes, and then it is said that um, Ibn Arabi shared with him of his inward light, so to speak, and that's how he knew that that he had not attained to the experience of Sufis, because the Sufis they the heart as a spiritual organ of cognition. Anyways, so therein, I think, albeit being a bit patchy, there is our brief of Islamic philosophy. In fact, if we want to pursue this path, many say Arabists and students of Islamic thought, the more interesting research study that is being pursued at the academic centers is to study the period precisely after Ibn Rushd. Is to focus on the Ottoman period, Safavid Persia, the Malay world. Meaning to say that Islamic philosophy, if you don't restrict it to the label of Aristotelian philosophy, continued to thrive for hundreds of years after Al-Ghazali. Now let us look therefore at the rise of the philosophy in the High Middle Ages. We know that a bit of a recapitulation from the last time, the era of Hellenistic philosophy. It culminated philosophically, but then as it became superseded with Christian thought, the the last word of the early medieval period, or the early period of Christian philosophy, was given to Augustine. Augustine became the ultimate authority with regards to theology. Already, the Augustinian system, as we mentioned the last time, is a composite, because himself was, given to the heresy of Manichaeanism, but he was able to free himself from that challenge through the arguments from Plotinus, and he had already elements of Platonism involved in his philosophy. But at the same time, after Augustine, philosophy gradually died off, shall we say, with just several sparks. I mean, in the writing of Boethius, but that was one that did not belong. The Christians continue to become the preservers of knowledge, certainly, meaning to say their monasteries continue to be centers whereby learning was taken, and they established schools, yes, with connections to the church that continues to educate the young people. And in the collapse of the Roman Empire, in fact, many of the hierarchical, many of the functions that was taken over by the surviving hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church, continued to be the preservers of culture, awaiting the period of, say, the Carolingian Renaissance in the 7th century under Charlemagne, but continue to build, and then gradually they built their powers, and by the 11th century or so, with more and more connections to they continue. I mean, the Muslim centers of learning continued to radiate knowledge, and gradually the writings of the philosophers arrived at them first through Arabic, and only later through direct translations from Greek. So gradually, as the European kings started establishing their power bases, yes, alongside the continual survival of the you find a build of the towards, say, a renaissance. But this is not the renaissance that we are accustomed to, the renaissance that led to the enlightenment. What I mean is a rebirth of learning. So gradually what had happened was that eventually the schools started to recognize several types of masters who are say, given authority to teach. So disciplines that were being theology, the liberal arts, law, and medicine. Yes, four. Yes, theology, the liberal arts, law, and medicine. So theology, of course, was considered like the hegemonic science, in which it has entrance into all these disciplines. So gradually, the schools, yes, with more and more during this time, the schools, when they organized themselves, made theology the subject matter. But gradually, several institutional changes took place during the 11th and the 12th century. So there was still in the Mediterranean and in Europe, there were three major civilizations that were still surviving, thriving. One was, of course, Islam in the east, the other Byzantine, and the third was the Latin West. Byzantine did not influence the Latin West much, because the Byzantine system combined together the religious bureaucracy with the monarchy, the monarchical system. So theology became intertwined with the demands of the state. With regards to Islam, there is also, of course, a fine relationship, in that you do not have a sort of dualism between, say, scientific learning and administration, because you had patronage and you had this relationship. But there was a sort of dualism, meaning to say, while recognizing the ecclesiastical power of the church, um, at the same time, there was a genuine recognition for the necessity of secular institutions and secular uh, rational and scientific knowledge, albeit very limited at first. And they would and the schools, on the other hand, they developed several important methodology and techniques so as to prepare them to imbibe the influx of ideas from the Islamic world. One was that in the study of theology, which is Augustinian in character, they introduced the notion of questions. Basically, the idea is that you would summarize the position, and then you would put, or rather, you would summarize, and then you would put the arguments for and against a particular. At the same time, there was also the notion of dialectics. And then thirdly, there was the notion of alternate readings to a particular sentence. But it was still surrounded by the writings, like such as the sentences of Peter Lombard, and several of the church fathers became matter. So during that age, they were in a sense incapable of growing beyond that. But with the successive introduction of an influx of data from the Islamic civilization in the form of translations and in the form of Aristotelian philosophy, in the form of natural science or natural philosophy that came, they had then to respond to this influx of a large body of knowledge, and thereby they had to come up with a system so as to harmonize this chaotic body of knowledge. So the questions, therefore, at that time, of course, maybe I can explain the rise of the institutions, how the schools transformed themselves to universities. First, the schools, yes, had several centers and several issues. Amongst the factors that contributed to the schools, and they became more and more until they became universities, was the ambitious kings and monarchs, like King Frederick II of Sicily. He wanted to support the University of Naples. He ensured that all the talents in that country, in order for, say, his administration, highly educated. So therefore, he wanted arts, and particularly law and medicine. In Italy, or in Salerno, or rather in Bologna, it was the students who began to see that in order for upward social mobility, education is necessary. Whereas one relied on the model of the patronage of the king, the one in Bologna relied on the notion of a student body. So the student become employers, or they became like a body that chose their instructors. So they were more, and they usually would compose of more mature audiences. Focus was the study of law, and in order to serve the shall we say the imperial, or rather the government, and to staff the government positions. As for Paris, now it's a place where the masters of theology they gathered together. So it was them, and after petitioning the Pope, they were recognized, yes, to found the University of Paris. This was theology, obviously, because were men of the church. Yes, so in Paris, they had, of course, the program of the liberal arts. Most of the students teach the liberal arts, but do not go on with theology. Only the most talented, the exceptionally talented, would go on to study theology. Now, with these systems in place, there were then, several madhahib, shall we say, of thought. Amongst the dominant one were the Latin Averroists. Why was the Latin Averroist very influential? Was because Ibn Rushd himself, Sina, they were very influential in this period for providing the cushion, or rather for providing the theistic foundation for the pagan philosopher Aristotle, because as Muslims who were theists, who show that you can somehow harmonize the philosophical positions of Aristotle with the theistic worldview, it became the churchmen, at least some of them were assuaged, or rather they were influenced to take the position that the same can be done for Christianity. But what had happened was that the Latin Averroes in their rationalism was more extreme than what Ibn Rushd was. Remember, Ibn Rushd introduced the notion of allegorical interpretation of the of verses. If, say, for example, the Aristotelian or the exercise of philosophy arrive at the conclusion which is different from that which is officially in the religion. The Latin Averroes, they thesis into what is called the double truth theory, the duplex veritas, hakikah al-musdawijah, shall we say. In other words, they say that what the finds for itself is true within its domain. What philosophy that talks about the natural world is in its domain. So true within different domains. Now this became the foundation for the Enlightenment thinking, and it became foundation for the secularization of the West. This notion of double truth. Yes, so that was the position of the Latin Averroes. So that's why, despite his great appreciation of Ibn Rushd, who was recognized at that time, Sharih, the commentator, who Aristotle, who was the philosopher, Aquinas, wrote extensively against the Latin Averroes. Now let's look then, if we have several minutes more, to look briefly at Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was a genius. Yes, I think all civilizations produce geniuses of their own. Of Thomas Aquinas, what is known is that he was a student and a pupil of Albertus Magnus. Yes, Albert the Great. Aristotle had first been banned, but by 1255, Aristotle was prescribed in the university, and Thomas Aquinas, at the year of a very young age of say only 30, was already in charge to be a master at the University of Paris at that time, a master regent at that time. And already even before he moved to Paris, he had written his first book, which is called On Essence and Existence, the Ente et Essentia, yes, in which he tried to deliberate the Avicennan distinction between essence and existence. And it said that, and Prof. Alatas is in Islam and Secularism, it is his misrepresentation of the idea of Ibn Sina that would gradually introduce of essence and existence. But more on that later. As for the adoption of the relationship between reason and revelation, so we have explored the position of the Latin Averroes, yes, the double truth. There was at the same time still remnants of the family of Tertullian, the early church father, who considered that philosophy is a bid'ah, philosophy is a vile sort of amusement of this world, because the ultimate truth is only sourced from the Bible, and they disliked especially Ibn Rushd, who said that in terms of nature, its most perfect representative and exemplar was Aristotle. The other strand, the other extreme, of course, was the later day Enlightenment thinkers, who thought that whatever is true is only that which can be proved by secular reason. Now, Aquinas tried to harmonize the relationship between the two, yes, without resulting to the double truth theory. One thing that he did was to say that, say for example, the study of philosophy. The aim of philosophy is to begin from the realm of the kaun, or the realm of existent beings, the realm of essences which has been given as existence. You are supposed to climb gradually from the realm of created things to the. So that's the foundation. It starts from the created beings arriving at the creator. So it has limitations, certainly. Theology, on the other hand, begins with the statement and the self-revelation of God, and out of that it goes to talk and inform to us about the nature of this world, and many things in between. So therefore, according to Aquinas, first to both philosophy and theology its own places, to recognize the limits of reason, that where reason has reached its limits, that's when theology or faith takes over. So, for example, philosophical speculation can only get you so far with regards to happiness, because of the things that philosophy considers to be happiness. The highest is speculation, but things that is secured based on the goods of grace, on the grace of faith, shall we say, happiness pertains to the afterlife, and this is beyond the ken of the human intellect. So that's the harmony which gradually became known as the Thomistic systems. Of course, if you were to look into the details of this, and within such a short time, the system of Thomas Aquinas would be undermined. Not to say because the harmony itself is problematic, not to say because the Thomistic synthesis in itself is problematic, but it is because the materials out of which he built the synthesis was problematic. First, there's the Augustinian theology, which is in itself problematic. And then secondly, there is Aristotelian philosophy, which we know is full of limitations. And I think with that, we have arrived at our full hour of say, presentation. And let us then open to, say, a round of questions, if you have any. Oh, there's a few already. Is there any clue or insight from Nas that inspired Ibn Sina that he felt supporting him on this notion of emanation, about emanation? Um, it is very difficult to say that. I mean, the emanationist thesis, um, uh, I mean, first you have to understand with regards to the philosophers, uh, in terms of that they consider that the notion of emanation, you know, can go against decisive uh, discussion or ayatul, like, you know, such as creation, and that is because the framework of thinking that they have inherited allows them to think within such a manner. So, meaning to say, even before, or rather, despite having been influenced by the Quran, having his worldview being shaped by the Quran, the sheer power, the sheer explanatory scheme, yes, is such that it would influence him in his construction, and he would, so to speak, he would be willing to bite the bullet with regards to temporal creation, because he thought that, I mean, logical and metaphysical priority would already preserve that. And remember, as we said just now, I mean, he thought in a systematic manner, because I mean, he, you know, in his system, he has to make continuous, shall we say, he has to make um, continuous negotiation. Meaning to say, if you want to preserve or rather, if you maintain the eternity of God, then you introduce this problem. You try to maintain that God knows particulars, then you introduce the problem. So, being led system, I mean, it is a systematic form of thinking. That's how he come to arrive at this emanationist scheme. Ibn Sina does not think in terms of, you know, necessarily. I mean, he was well aware of the Nas, but he understood also that I mean, he understood the notion of, say, logical priority. He understood the notion of the necessity that the system must be complete, must be coherent, and so on. And all these things are perhaps what led him to these conclusions. Wallahu a'lam. Secondly, Why is history of philosophy continuation of Greek philosophy and Hellenistic philosophy? What are special features that were always taught, or rather contributions that appeal to the Middle Age philosophers? As we said just now, in contrast to the other, Rush is more, at least in his philosophy, more purely Aristotelian. Meaning to say, first in his commentaries, he preserved the Aristotelian conclusions. He tries to give explanations, certainly, and in certain regards, he does, I mean, allow for his religious belief to enter into his explanation. To give an example, with regards to his position on bodily resurrection, he doesn't consider bodily resurrection to mean we will be resurrected with our body. He considers that man's identity is his soul or spirit, but in terms of resurrection, there will be something like a simulacrum, a body, shall we say, a different body that will be created for you in order to experience the pleasures of the afterlife. And as for the shall we say, the continuation of Greek philosophy and Hellenistic philosophy in Averroes, as we said just now, he wanted that strand of the commentary tradition from Philoponus, from Plotinus, and from the other discussions of the Aristotelian tradition, preserving that continuity. I understood your question. How many priorities? Oh, temporal, logical priorities. To say prior means to be something, simply means to be before, meaning to say it has to have a higher ontological position. That would be ontological prior. You can speak also, I mean, in terms of the categories. I mean, this would be something that you'll have to verify yourself. In how many categories priority apply? You can, I mean, you look at the 10 categories of Aristotle and see. Say, for example, with regards to quantity, um, and then quality, with regards to time, does all these things admit of the notion of priority? And once you have done that, I mean, I cannot do that on the spot right now, but this is something of a research question for yourself, I suppose. Yes, you can study yourself how many priorities are there in the categories of Aristotle, or for example in metaphysics. Wallahu alam. Any other questions? I thank you for your. If I may add a bit on the philosophy in the um, as we said just now, that Thomas's name is to be prominent during this period, because he arrived at this notion of the Thomistic synthesis. Aside from his Summa Theologiae, yes, built in the model of Al-Farabi, but it is a work that is a consummation of all things with regards to philosophy in a systematic manner. He has also written a book called Summa Contra Gentiles, and this was before Theology. The Summa Contra Gentiles is another illuminating work if you want to read, because this is where Aquinas addresses the notion of minds that has not come into contact with God's self-revelation, either through Judaism or through the New Testament. Yes, so according to him, that as for the Gentiles, meaning to say, this is the treatise which he wrote to determine the limits of human reason. And in this, he wants to say that human reason can arrive only so far with regards to the knowledge of God, that there will be certain things which is beyond it, and this is answered in the Summa Theologiae. Of course, Aquinas was a very dynamic thinker. It wasn't just in metaphysics and epistemology and theological questions that he dealt with. He also dealt with the question of politics. He dealt with the notion of justice, and amongst his influential thought patterns that continue to influence the Renaissance period even, was his discussion of the just war. Yes, what would constitute a just war? When is a Christian monarch? When is he allowed, for example, to invade another country? Under what circumstances? All these things were discussed by Aquinas, and the externality was such that some thinkers during the the Portuguese and the Spanish period of the Reconquista relied on the doctrine of the just war in order to justify their incursions into South America and even well into our part of the world. Is it said that Aquinas modified Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism through the understanding of Pseudo-Dionysius? How do we understand that? Why some Muslim scholars said that Aquinas influenced by Al-Ghazali, and how? Uh, we know that it wasn't just Al-Ghazali that influenced Aquinas. I mean, he knows of Aquinas knows of Al-Ghazali through the Maqasidul Falasifa, because he was known to, I mean, directly the in one of the peripatetics. Al-Ghazali Maqasid al-Falasifa to summarize the teachings. And in order to understand philosophy, you would begin by reading the Maqasid al-Falasifa, the intentions of the philosophers, so to speak. But Al-Ghazali was also very important for Aquinas, because he knew of Al-Ghazali through uh, um, the tahafut to tahafut. Yes, so meaning to say he knows through Averroes' refutation of Al-Ghazali, the ideas of Al-Ghazali I reproduce, because in order to refute it, Averroes would write the ideas of Al-Ghazali there. So these are some of the influences through which Al-Ghazali would come into the system of an Aquinas. But I think, uh, relatively, Ibn Sina has also influenced Al-Ghazali, Aquinas deeply, especially the problem of sense and existence. Was Ibn Sina's notion of the distinction between wujud and mahiyah, yes, existence and essence, that allowed um, Aquinas to solve the problem of the universals, understood whether or not they are in nature, they are in the minds of man, whether they exist as ideas in the this discussed in quite a number of detail in that book, Essence and Existence. So these are some of the influences of Ibn Sina. So Ibn Sina, in his in his synthesis, has used the ideas of the scholars that I mentioned. Platonism was gotten through the Pseudo-Dionysius. That I mean, that several strands of Neoplatonism, especially via the Pseudo-Dionysius, also got entry into Thomistic thought. These are part and parcel of the Thomistic synthesis. Um, yes. So how do we understand that? Well, to understand Aquinas is to understand, as I said just now, first the harmony between reason and revelation, and second the synthesis between Avicenna in terms of essence and existence, and the theology of Augustine, and chiefly also the fact that with regards to Thomas Aquinas, his absorption of Aristotelian thought is chiefly seen in his encouraged development of the physics and the employment of reason, and this opened the doors, speak, of say the study of two separate domains which otherwise would have not been taken into the epistemology of the Middle Ages, and that is the Thomistic synthesis allowed for the study of nature, and the Thomistic synthesis allowed for a more careful study of history. So with history and nature becoming two subject matters, now these being under the rubric, shall we say, the influence of the Thomistic synthesis, well celebrated together for the strengthening of the initial seeds of secular civilization in the West, eventually until it reaches its secular proportions in the Renaissance period. Is there any more questions? Are there any more questions? So now, as for the limitations of Aquinas' thought, first, his conception of reason, the Aristotelian conception of reason. And what is the problem with this? Well, this is the reduction of reason to that of ratio, meaning to say that aspect of reason that systematizes the objects of sense experience, that aspect of reason that gives logical ordering to aspect of reason which is otherwise known as the discursive aspect. Yes, the systematizer, shall we say, in our intellect. So he's reduced the power of the intellect to that, because that is the Aristotelian system. Remember, Aristotelian system is both rationalism and naturalism. The fact that nature is understood as being capable of being understood by the ratiocinative aspect. So already is limited to the contemporary Bonaventure, who, as Prof. Alatas mentioned, had had access to the ideas deriving from the Quran, conceive of nature as the great book, and this was not something that has held. The notion of nature as the great book signifies that nature can be studied as a essence of God, whose meanings ultimately are to be discerned based on the guidance of theology, on that separation of ratio and intellectus. But unfortunately, because of the currents during that time, it was Bonaventure. I mean, since these ideas were not properly congenial to the Christian thought, because Christian thought already in the early Middle Ages has, due to the influences coming from Hellenism and chiefly Aristotle, had decided that had demeaned the status of nature, and coupled with this power of human epistemology, gradually separated the domain of reason. And despite the harmonizing effort of Aquinas, he wasn't capable of doing it. So that's the limitations that we can that has highlighted. Yes. Well, if there are any more questions, perhaps you can still continue to write it to the organizers. I know that we will have to take a recess during the month of Ramadan, but inshallah, when Shawwal comes, I will discuss with our brothers, and perhaps we will arrange of lectures thereafter. I'd like to thank everyone for for your patience and for participating in this. I would encourage everyone, of course, to read further and to things, and to form structures in your minds about the history of philosophy, and to continue to read, and to not uh, give up, I suppose. Inshallah, may Allah grant us understanding, but we have to keep our intention pure. Okay, let's make this question 5 the last question. What do you think about other theologians, the likes of Taftazani, e.g., the Western thought of contemporary philosophy? Well, the likes of Taftazani, the late, and e.g., the late period of Ash'ari philosophy. What has happened in, I mean, for this you have to read the writings of the Orientalists. With regards to the Orientalists, they have lot or Western thinkers. They started losing interest after Ibn Rushd because they have identified philosophy only insofar as it continued to influence the rest of the thinkers. Yes, ones in the region of Tosania, the region of Persia, the ones in the region of Mughal India, Ottoman Turkey, and the this, at least initially, did not occupy the interest of Western scholars because these thinkers, they developed within the fashion of Islamic thought that did not influence the Western thinking directly. But interestingly, I think Professor Zaini of Cassis, our teacher, in for the past few years, been trying to develop the history of thought in the Islamic world, focusing on the 17th century. 17th century is a very exceptional century in our tradition because first, when we look at the West, it was very active, certainly, because that was the secularizing period. That was the century of the scientific revolution. That was the century that prepared for the Enlightenment. That was the century that developed all these notions of natural philosophy, natural law, and several other systems of civilization. In the Muslim world, there was an ontological metaphysical turn. You had the continuous tradition of the commentators of Ibn Arabi. In Turkey, you had, Al-Kunawi, and you had of Konya, yes, and of course Al-Ankaravi, yes, of Ankara, and you had the likes of in the Malay world, in Raniri, and Raniri was still developing the ideas from the tradition of the commentary on the writings of Ibn Arabi, which he also uses and combines with the ideas of the late Ash'ari theologians. So their subject matter was a discussion on ontology and metaphysics. So that was that period, which I think is very important. And with Western thought, they started losing interest in the subject matter of all these scholars like Al-Iji, Taftazani, and so on, was because um, they wanted to focus their ideas more on positive science in the empirical sense, and they started losing interest in theology and metaphysics for not seeing what would be the function and purpose of having these things. But now, I mean, after a whole century of trial and error, I think it's in the 21st century would be a good time to revive the relationship. Now that the West has seen that without their metaphysical foundations, even their philosophy of science become a sort of game, so to speak, because without a secure foundation, the positive aspects would become meaningless. So this is about the time that Islamic metaphysics. Unfortunately, Prof. Latas has given us a prolegomena for that, meaning to say an introduction for that. And if you look at the writing of Prof. Latas as discussions on existence, now that's where the writings of E.G., Al-Taftazani, and so on, coupled with the writings of the Sufi metaphysicians, come into play. So in a sense, Prof. Alatas has picked up on the development of Kalam, Falsafah, Tasawwuf of the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, represented, re-articulated in our present day language in order to solve some of the major problems of our times. So that's my response. Oh, you said philosophy, particularly metaphysics, was assimilated into the ihsan part of the religion. Yes. So we say that in the early if tasawwuf, um, even pre-naming period before it gained their name, amongst the tabi'in, the likes of Hassan al-Basri, and then gradually you see the likes of Sufyan al-Thawri, Abu Harith al-Muhasibi, that line of scholars culminating in Junaid. Yes, those Sufis initially focus their method on the practice of religion. as Prophet Alatas defines tasawwuf as the practice of Sharia at the maqam of ihsan. They were people who contemplated deeply on the significance of this, to worship Allah as if you see Him. And Imam Al-Ghazali gives a very good description of the Sufis in his Munkid min al-Dalal. And Sufis are people who follow the path of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as best as they could, meaning follow the Sunnah internally and externally until they were rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the metaphysics, depending, of course, on their own latent potential and capacity. They were given the the specific ahwal, as the maqamat and the ahwal, the internal illuminative knowledge. Now, why I said metaphysics became assimilated into the ihsan part of the religion, the metaphysical aspects, yes, these metaphysical concepts are helpful to explain and to give a framework to the experience, their authentic spiritual experiences. Because after having experienced the things which are mentioned, yes, and some of these experiences are recorded even in the Quran with regards to what Prophet Musa alayhi salam experienced, yes, when he fainted at the site of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mountain. So these experiences, yes, and then it would develop the terminologies and nomenclatures would be for tasawwuf. But of course, the tasawwuf in this metaphysical sense of the word became developed in the Junaid Baghdadi sense of school, and this is the school that Prophet Alatas ascribes himself to, and said that Sheikh Nuruddin Ar-Raniri was also part of, and he presents and he produces for us the sanad of Sheikh Nuruddin Ar-Raniri that connects himself to this tradition of the Sufis who their experience the metaphysics. Yes, and this is of course, in order to properly appreciate this, I think we would require a sort of maybe a course or an outline of the development of the school of Tasawwuf. Among the writings that we can read is the book of Al-Kalabadi on the description of the school of Tasawwuf, and certainly Kushairi's Risalah and several other books that is arranged progressively to understand why is it that the Sufis gradually develop their metaphysics. Especially Al-Kushairi, who presented his Risalah Kushairiyah in the original Arabic, of course, because I've seen an edition in English that the Idah of the Sufis is taken out because it focuses only on the maqam and ahwal. But in the Arabic, you would find in the Risalah Kushairiyah the Aqidah of the Sufis, and you can see how easily their experience of Tawheed of the highest order can be elaborated into a metaphysics, and that is what is done. But to do this properly, inshallah, will require us to be in the week where we discuss contemporary Islamic metaphysics. But with some patience, we will meet and discuss that. Any other, I suppose, final questions, since this is our last meeting temporarily? I saw one more. There's by Sister Tasnim, yes? I mean, could you send it to me? I haven't seen it, this last question. Oh, okay. It's clear that we are in a position that is truly descriptive of the fundamental nature of phenomena as process, is existence alone, both understood as well as a reality, the most basic and universal entity known to us. Where existence understood does not correspond with process, how do we explain that existence is not merely a concept, but also reality? Yeah, of course. I mean, there's two possible there's two possible ways of explaining what existence is. The one that we are used to, explaining existence as a concept, is a static idea, meaning to say this is what Aquinas was grappling with. So the as Prof. Alatas was mentioning, in the Islamic intellectual tradition, properly there are only two schools: essentialists and they are the existentialists. The essentialists are people who consider that the primary realities of things are essences. Existence is a sort of a secondary quality that is super added to the essence. Yes, meaning to say, you can arrive at, you can arrive at description of a substance without knowledge of its existing. Now uh, that's our regular, that's our regular common sense notion of existence. That's our regular notion. Common sense notion of existence is that existence is this static concept that is applied to essences. So we know of essences of matter that somehow, when existence is super added to them, they become existing. And this is also when Kant tried to investigate the meaning of essence, or investigate the meaning of existence. He therefore considers that existence is properly not a primary quality, because it is understood in this notion. But the dynamic conception of existence would end that they exist with um, the dynamic conception of existence considers existence as the primary. Remember, within the Avicennan conception, within the Avicennan ontology, with regards to God, existence is his very essence. To exist is his very essence. So this is once we start thinking, once we develop habits of mind to think of existence as a dynamic process that is ever in a state of action, yes, kulla yawmin huwa fi sha'an, then gradually, if just by saying this, the understanding is being transferred. But if you acquire the understanding that existence is this dynamic entity, this dynamic being, yes, this is existence, that um, uh, that goes into the processes of identification, individual, and distinction, and processes of voluntary creation of other things. Now this is the proper conception of existence. Of course, more to say on this. In order to properly do justice to this, we'll have to explain the several degrees of existence, and the intuition of existence as properly put, so as not to create confusion, and so as not to say things that will lead to false interpretation. But briefly, that's how we say that existence is not merely a concept, but ultimately we can form conceptions of that existence. But our conception in that commonsensical understanding could have been wrong, and it could be corrected. Yes. Tasneem. All right. If there are no more questions, I would like to thank everyone for your participation, and please forgive me for um, any uh, shortcomings on my part in the. Feel free to ask questions in the period that we have between now and the next session until we meet, insyaAllah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
يا الله بها يا الله بها يا الله بحسن الخاتمة والقبول إلى حضرة الرسول سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم.